Guys, I'm here today to expose the Kama Sutra and explain to you what is the new model or the new paradigm of sexuality. Let's get it.
I'm inspired. I'm inspired.
Hey there guys, how's it going? My name is Sumedh Chatterjee from the Flow Zone Academy, and I'm a flow state coach, which means that I help you feel better and perform better. Today we're talking about this idea of Kama Sutra and how it's been widely misunderstood, okay? So the word Kama means pleasure or desire, okay? Let's start to understand that this is a lot more about pleasure alchemy than we think it is, okay? And when we understand that Tantra might be also linked to this phase, and when we think about Tantra, we also immediately recognize it as sex. And there's a lot of Western influence that came in that made it more about sexuality. Of course, sexuality is a big theme, however, it's not the only thing, right? Like, the Kama Sutra talks about how to keep a wife, like the art of seduction. It talks about like different household tools, different ways of having furniture. Also has pretty taboo stuff in it. And, they were talking about biting and scratching and all this kind of stuff, love bites. They also talk about like what type of woman to stay away from, like how to be like a courtesan or a sex worker, right? Like, they also mentioned like some things that shouldn't have probably been mentioned, but hey, it was a product of its time, okay? So because of this understanding, I started to explore this into further depth. Like, chapter 2 is the only one that talks about sexual union, unless you're talking about a couple of other chapters referencing love bites and all this kind of stuff, right? So I got this thing. It's a Sriran Yantra. Okay, Sriran Yantra is like, it basically changes the consciousness in a room that it's in. Whenever you look at it, it's supposed to basically alter your state of consciousness to create a frequency around you. Usually it creates a consciousness of prosperity or things to happen, right? Now, Tantra is interesting because Tantra means to expand or to stretch or to loom or to weave. From the old Rig Vedas, we understand that that's the original meaning, Tan, which means to pull, and Tra, which is an instrument or a tool or a technology, right? This is an expansion technology. This is getting us to our stretch zones, right, in a sense. You see, Tantra is basically a physical enlightenment, okay? The path to Tantra, or a Tantrika, is a physical enlightenment. It's not a mental enlightenment. This guy named Pierre, he came over with some of the Tantric teachings and completely reinvented it for his own gratification, we could say, right? He kind of used it as a way to make him the guy, like he's an Orientalist who brought the ideas of Tantra to the West, right? And then the same with the Kama Sutra, Richard Burton brought it into the Victorian era that was very, very repressed at that time sexually, right? And so it wasn't until 100 years later, from the 1800s or so, right, when they finally started to have this sexual revolution, and it was brought into the US, and then it finally started to spread, right? So Kamadeva can be seen as the god of love or pleasure in a sense, and what I'm learning from Kamadeva is this understanding that love is this frequency that we can tap into. It's basically about creating these moments of connection with another person and keep on stacking those moments of connection. And I'm also understanding the importance of spontaneity when it comes down to this, because spontaneity, what it is it's those little glimpses or glimmers, or those moments that are those peak or ecstatic experiences that we remember in our consciousness, and so it gets embedded more, right? Peak experiences get embedded more. So if you're having lots of peak experiences, it is actually shaping your mind a lot faster. Hey, why did we only come back with the sex stuff? Like, this is a guide to life or a manual to living in some way, right? Well, sex sells, and everybody wants to know how to improve their sex lives. Like, even people with awesome sex lives want want to know ways to improve it, you know. And so it's like so taboo, and it's still taboo to talk about this topic of sex. However, understanding that it was such a revolutionary thing of its time that people were actually mentioning these kinds of things, right? To live in luxury, to live in leisure, and to really manage this thing called pleasure or desire. And what is it? What goes into this? What are the conducts around it? I think after a certain point, it became more about controlling sexuality. It teaches men and women. That's the interesting thing in the Kamasutra, right? It doesn't only teach men, it doesn't only teach women. It teaches both genders, and there's this power play factor that comes into it, which nowadays we'd be like, oh, this is gender norms or whatever, but it's very interesting to just reflect on it, or at least break it down. I mean, a treatise on desire, right? It's really interesting. It takes India to make sex into a science. I think that's such an Indian thing to do in general. Don't get me wrong, like the positions, all this kind of stuff, I mean, that's great. You know, that's great. And I think it's also very controversial because they're the first ones who kind of stated that, hey, you know, sex can be fun. It's not only for procreation. It can be like an activity. It can be a pleasurable activity that two people do. So sex is not only about rearing a child, right? It's about having fun, and it's about having pleasure. And it's important to understand that concept because I think we miss out on it, or we deeply misunderstood it. We live in a very sexually charged culture where sex is in a lot of the marketing and we see it everywhere, but then there's also a taboo against it. So this disconnection, or at least this split in the consciousness, gets us to feel shame or guilt around this topic, right? And we don't feel like we can open up or talk about it. But I think it's very, very important specifically to teach kids proper sex education and you know, start to understand that, hey, this is something that everyone does and everyone goes through. Like it's completely fine, you know. And I think bringing out of the shame of looking at those, you know, ancient temples and seeing all these weird people in sex positions, right? Instead of looking at it like that, to actually see it beyond and see the art form of it and the philosophy around it. It makes everything more meaningful to see it from the vast perspective of all these 9 chapters rather than the one chapter that we zoomed in on, right? So why am I interested in this stuff, man? Well, because I feel that I've always been a very sexual being, a sexual person. I think that I am still figuring out ways to communicate my sexuality in the most healthy way and expression. So that's been a part of my journey. So that's why I'm looking into this, because I know that there's definitely many roots in my own culture that can help me out. And also speaking with people in this field, or at least in the Neo-Tantra field, it's all about living tradition, right? It's all about taking the tradition and how we can apply it to our lives, and that's when it becomes a practical version of this. However, bite-sized information and, you know, half information can also lead to a lot of issues. But hey, we've got to achieve gnosis some way, right? We've got to have some form of path that we follow. And so Tantra definitely scared a few people because of its associations with Kali, who's actually a very terrifying female goddess, right? And also Kalabhairava, which is like a very fearful and dangerous form of Shiva. And he's the most feared form, right? It's really, really interesting how Tantra is associated with these deities, right? These so-called sex gods, right? In a sense. I think as the Kundalini rises, our sexuality expands, and it needs a different way or a different pathway to do things. It needs a different system or a process to follow. And one that raises to a higher vibration or a higher frequency. They're going to look at the very thing that created that life, which is sex, right? They're going to go to the origin point. And so it's only natural that the topic of sex is looked at because that's the thing that created us, right? And so it's a creation frequency. So understand that and how that applies to your spiritual practice. And maybe you can develop some tools to get to this union with the divine, which is what Tantra is trying to do, which is what the The Kama Sutra, on the other hand, is teaching us about pleasure and how to maintain it. So I think it's time for not just these British people coming in and taking our books and, rewriting them in their own words. I'm not talking about this, but I'm talking about, hey, where are the modern day mystics who are taking this information and actually making it very applicable to people, right? Maybe people are at a specific level of consciousness and they want to expand. They want to use this as a tool for expansion, which is what Tantra is, right? So this is the truth of the matter, and I'm giving you a new paradigm to step into, which is the paradigm of flow state, right? When you're having a sexual encounter, to embrace the flow state of it, meaning to be completely engaged and present and mindful during the whole experience, because too many people are having unconscious sex, which is why we even needed a Kama Sutra or Tantra in the first place, right? So it comes back to the stretching or the slowing down of time. So get out of your comfort zone and get into your Tantra zone. Have an incredible day. May the flow be with you and stay legendary. Let's get it today. Boom.